How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
So today on the Culture Architects Show, we're joined by Roberta Matuson. Roberta is known as the talent maximizer. She was introduced to corporate leadership at a very young age. She was 24 years old, and she had helped build the human resources department it was a large commercial real estate firm. And then she later helped take the company through a public offering. So she's seen a lot. Her own firm, Matuson Consulting, was later established back in 1997. And the last 25 plus years, she's worked with a lot of big companies, including companies like General Motors and Takeda Pharmaceuticals, Microsoft, the Boston Beer Company, etc. So she's got a very strong background for us. Roberta, we're excited to hear your thoughts on talent and workforce and of course, as we always talk about here, culture building. So welcome to the Culture Architects podcast, Roberta.
Well, I'm very excited to be here, David. So thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. So I want to go back to the beginning for our audience. So you were at a pretty young age and you're at this real estate firm and being brought into an executive level at a very young age. So how did that happen?
Well, it is a very interesting story. Mm-hmm. I went into work one day and only to find out that my boss had been fired.
Oh.
So I did what I thought any other 24-year-old would do. I went into the president's office and I asked for her job.
Wow.
And he actually gave it to me.
That shows some gumption, which obviously would not be normal for a 24-year-old. So is that something?
I don't know. I'm from New York.
All right.
So
yeah, but
in New York, that was normal behavior.
Okay, well, maybe
but I was
good.
living in Texas, so probably in Texas, not so normal.
Yes. And so was that something, do you think that kind of, I'm going to use the word gumption, the willingness to step up and say, hey, can I have a job as a young age? Is that something, do you think is that your family upbringing or is it just being a New Yorker that gave you that kind of thing?
I think it was being a New Yorker.
Okay. You're very forward and let's go.
Let's get this done.
So you were there for a bunch of years. And how did you learn about, you were the human resources person. How did you develop your skills? You were young and didn't know much at that time.
Well, actually, I thought I knew a lot.
Okay. Another New York attribute.
Yes, another New York attribute. I learned a lot by taking courses. My boss actually gave me a coach, which was really helpful.
Nice.
He gave me the choice of either hiring a staff or hiring consultants. And I thought to myself, if I hire a staff, I really don't know what I'm doing. But if I hire consultants, I can learn from them. So I went with that approach. And then while I was there, I also got my MBA at night. So that really helped me as well.
So you're a learner from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And so you're 24 years old. How many people were in the company at the time that you were there?
Probably about 300.
Okay. Which is a pretty significant company. And then that grew and eventually went public. Is that correct? How big was it when it went public?
Oh, I don't even remember. It was big. And this is at a time when companies weren't going public like every other day.
Mm-hmm.
So and I'll be honest with you, David, I remember my boss coming into my office and he handed me this envelope and I was like, okay, thanks. And then one of the other directors came in and I'm like, what's this? And they were stock options. And he said, put them in your drawer. They'll be worth a lot of money someday. Wow. And that's how naive I was. Right. I was like, okay. And I did exactly what he said. I put them in my drawer.
And they hopefully were worth a lot of money.
And
eventually.
They were, yes, they helped me get off to a very good start.
That's great. So how many years were you there?
I was there for 6 years.
Okay.
And then I got taken out by a wave I never saw coming.
Yeah. Which was,
I didn't manage up. I didn't know what it was. And I didn't build relationships with the senior executives that were my peers. And, office politics, it's a very common story, but it wasn't one that I was familiar with, which is why I wrote the book Suddenly in Charge, because I wanted to make sure what happened to me didn't happen to anyone else.
Wow. So I'm curious, and this is always a sensitive direction to go. But how much of that experience do you think was unique to your role? And how much of that do you think that women leaders run into that challenge even more than men leaders?
Well, it's hard for me to say, right? Because I remember, first of all, I was one of two women on the executive team. And there were a lot of people on that team. So, and again, I think some of it comes back to being naive and thinking like the behaviors are normal and, just going with it. Today, as as I look back, I can see a lot of what went on really wasn't cool. And if it went on today, maybe I would have handled things differently.
Yeah.
But then again, I wouldn't have had the material to write, 7 books.
Yeah. And so as you sat down to write that first book, that was really about your experience and wanting to help other people not go through what you went through.
Yes, which is why half the book is on managing up. And I didn't do that. But then I learned, like, what is this? And how do you do this? And how do you make sure that you don't get caught in these political situations that you don't know what you're doing, and so how do you avoid these situations?
So if you were to summarize the key points for managing up for our audience, obviously they should read your book and get into a lot more detail. But if they were to get the highlights of these are the key things you got to do if you're going to manage up, these are key things. Well, not even if you're going to, you need to manage up.
Exactly.
And these are 2 or 3 things that are critical components that people often miss that you would advise them. Yes,
I think that so many times when we get into these positions of leadership, we spend a lot of time on the tactical pieces and we have our heads down and we just want to make sure we get all the tactical pieces right. And when we do that, we fail to look up and we don't build relationships. And everything that happens in organizations is really based on relationships. So managing up is about managing your boss and his or her peers so you can get the resources that you need for your employees and for yourself.
And so what are a couple things that you would advise somebody to do? That I'm in a management role, I'm in my company, I'm part of the executive team, or maybe I'm one level beneath the executive team. What are a couple things I ought to be doing to manage up? To build those relationships.
You need to be very observant. You need to look around and see who in the organization holds the power. And then you need to figure out how they're using that power. You need to stop saying, no, I don't have time to go to lunch and start going to lunch with the people who are your peers or above you so that you can get to know them on a more personal basis. You need to do what I call shameless promoting. You need to promote yourself and let people know what you're doing. Because if you are the best kept secret in the organization, others are going to get promoted and you're just going to be sitting there wondering what happened.
It's interesting. My own personal experience has always been with small to mid-sized companies. And so I haven't had the experience personally of working inside a much larger organization where those kinds of, I'll call them political dynamics, might be, I'm guessing, more prevalent. Do you think it's largely a function of, as organizations get larger, that kind of, for lack of a better word or phrase, I'll call it political environment becomes more prevalent in a much larger company? Or do you see that in smaller companies as well?
I see it in smaller companies as well. And I also see it in nonprofits. And I think it all comes down to resources, right? So when money is tight, everybody is jockeying for position. Everybody's jockeying for staff. And the people who are well positioned are the ones that get those requisitions approved. They get the raises that their people need while you're sitting back losing talent. So it really comes down to resources in many situations.
Okay. Interesting. So shift gears a little bit. And so you've done a lot of work in this area of helping people learn how to manage up and across, not just up, but throughout the organization. But it seems like a big part of your work has also been on, well, you call yourself the talent maximizer. So on how do you attract and retain the best talent? And certainly everywhere I go, that might be the number one topic I hear people talking all all about today. Everybody's frustrated at they say, you just can't find anybody good these days. Everybody's complaining about that. So talk to me more about that.
Oh, I love it when they say that because they don't know who they're talking to. And they say, oh, nobody wants to work. And then
I hear that all the time.
I'm from New York and I cannot help myself. And I just say, actually they do. They just don't want to work for you.
Mm. Yeah.
Okay. So think about it.
Yeah. So, how does a company become the kind of place that people want to come to work? And let me ask you, I'll even broaden that question. Is it the company or is it the person, or to what degree is it each?
Well, companies are made up of people, right? So it's interesting. After I wrote Suddenly in Charge, I wrote a book called Talent Magnetism. Mm-hmm. And when I write books, I don't read them until after I finish writing them. Mm-hmm. And when I finished reading that book, I said, oh my gosh, like the whole secret here is magnetic leaders, right? And so that's why the following book is called The Magnetic Leader. It's about creating leaders in the organization that are so magnetic that people stick to them and they attract talent rather than repel talent. Mm-hmm. So it does come down to the leadership. It always comes down to the leadership, which goes back to the culture, right?
Yeah, which comes from the leadership. In a recent podcast, we interviewed a guy named Tim Stryker, and Tim wrote a book, and I may not get the title correct, but we'll put it in our show notes so that people get the right correct. But I think it was called Becoming the Leader People Want to Follow, or something along those lines. And he had an interesting point of view or observation from his research. So he shared your point of view that, okay, there are some leaders that people want to follow, and others, I wouldn't join your company. Why would I want to follow you? And so he and his consulting firm did a lot of research on those leaders who are the kind of people that others would want to follow, whether it's magnetism or whatever word you want to use. And he found an interesting principle that he calls the who, not what principle. And the gist of what he says is that he looked at a variety of attributes of leaders. Mm-hmm. And he discovered that of the 8 or so important attributes of a leader, there were 2 of them that had a disproportionate impact on whether they were somebody people wanted to follow or not. And the 2 that had the most impact, he calls them who, not what, because they were about the person's character more than they were about their skill set. They were, whether they had great strategy skills or vision or whatever else. It was more about who they were as people. And then he goes on to further break that down into 2 aspects of high character leaders. One he calls being inwardly sound. That's the phrase he uses. Basically, you got your stuff together. And the other he calls being others focused, serving other people. So I'm curious about, does that match your experience that the best leaders that are magnetic, that people want to stick to, as you said, it's more about their character than their skill set or their talents or other things? Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I would. I mean, look, you have to have the skills,
sure, right,
to do the job. But in my book, I talk about the, 7 traits of magnetic leaders, and and they are people-based, like authenticity.
Yep.
Like people know what version of you is going to show up today.
Yeah.
Rather than, oh, she's really nice one day to everybody, and the next day she's just a lion. Like, right. Who is this person? And transparency, like they're going to tell you the truth. And when they can't tell you the truth, they're going to tell you, I'm not able to share this information right now, but when I can, I will.
Yes.
So, there's a lot of these traits that go back to the inside as opposed to, well, I have an MBA, right. I understand AI,
right.
blah, blah, blah.
So so you've named 2 of those, transparency and authenticity. What are the other 5 traits in your book?
You're going to have to read it.
Okay. All right.
We have to leave something for people to,
that's fine.
To dig into.
Okay. So it's interesting. In our company, we do a book of the month, lunch and learn. where we choose a book to read and get together on a Zoom call over lunch and talk about it. So we may have to pick that book. But the book we're reading this month as we're recording this is Stephen Covey's Speed of Trust. Have you read that book? Such a wonderful book. And he similarly identifies a series of traits or behaviors, authenticity and transparency being two of them, that are the behaviors that, whether they're from leaders or not, tend to be the behaviors that create trust in an organization. So I'm curious about your point of view. And so what role does trust play in becoming the kind of place that attracts people?
Well, it's everything. I mean, if I can't trust what you say you're going to do, and it comes down to even what we might think as leaders is the smallest thing, like, oh, your performance review is due. I'm sorry I couldn't get it done on time. I'm going to have it for you on Monday. And then Monday comes along and there's no performance review. And then the employee goes back and says, hey, it's Wednesday. Oh, I'll get it to you by Friday. And, we know this game, David. It could be another 2-3 months. That's like not a cool thing. And it breaks that bond. And it's really easy to break trust and it's really hard to build it.
Yeah. One of the behaviors that you're describing there in our company, so we teach, as most of our listeners know, we teach companies to build a set of behaviors that are the foundation of their culture. And we call them fundamentals. And one of them that's in every single one of our clients, because it's so foundational to trust, we call it simply honor commitments. Do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. Pretty darn big thing. And it's amazing how poor people are at that.
And it is simple. We're not asking you to, carry 50-pound sacks of potatoes through the office.
Just do what you said you're going to do. Although what's interesting is when I'm working with employees and we talk about honoring commitments, my experience is that the reason that there are many reasons that people don't always honor their commitments, but it more often than not, in my experience, is not that they didn't think it was important to, or they didn't care, or they were dismissive about it. But often my experience is people make commitments they shouldn't. They say yes to things that aren't realistic. I mean, in your example, if I really can't have that performance review by Monday, I would have been better off being honest about it and saying, you know what, I wish I could do that. But given what else is on my plate between now and Monday, it's not going to happen. I will have it to you by Friday, but you can count on it will be there on Friday. But we often say yes to things, either to please our boss or to please a customer sometimes. It's with the right intention. And then we say yes to a bunch of things that didn't get done.
Right. But my whole thing is it's our behaviors that matter, not our intentions.
I totally agree. And so to get better at that, in my experience, you have to be more rigorous about what you say yes to and no to. So if you can't do it, don't say yes, and be somebody that people can rely on. Right.
I absolutely agree.
So talk to me about, you've coined this phrase and labeled yourself as the talent maximizer. Tell me more about that. So what does that mean and where does that phrase come from?
Well, it comes from the fact that I help organizations attract top talent that will stick around. Okay. And I also help them create the talent inside the organization that is needed to fuel their growth. And then I also, on the other side, I work with, I do a lot of executive coaching and I help people up their leadership skills so that they are those attractive candidates or that they are ready to step up and help the organization grow. So, it's all about talent. My whole world is about talent.
Right. And certainly my experience is that an organization with better talent will move light years faster and further than one with less talent.
Absolutely. And with a lot less problems.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And those problems are what leaders find exhausting.
Yeah. And so talk to me about how that connects to building the kind of culture that will attract people. Is it just leaders, or are there other things from your point of view or experience companies ought to be doing to create the culture that does help them attract and retain the kind of people they want?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, I'm not sure if you read today's Wall Street Journal.
I did not.
But Netflix just came out with their new state of the culture
And
statement.
their stuff has been so famous up until now.
Right. Well, they've updated it.
Okay,
So
I'll take a look.
It's kind of interesting how they take it so seriously that they've had I think 15,000 people involved in this culture document, and how they've simplified it because they believe that if it's too complicated, no one's going to take it seriously. So I think it's really interesting that they got really clear on what culture means for their organization. And I say for their organization because if they're just going to take somebody else's document, that's not going to work.
Sure.
So I just think it's really important to be realistic. Like if your culture is, look, we're going to work you to the bone, but we're going to pay you really well, say it. Because there's a lot of people who would like to earn a lot of money and they don't care if they're working really hard. Don't try to be someone you're not. But as part of that, I also help organizations create their employer brands. And if nobody knows about you, you could be the best darn organization on the planet. But if no one's heard of you, even in your local neighborhood, it's kind of hard to attract that talent because it's a lot easier to get people to say, come to you and say yes to your offer if they've come to you rather than you going after them.
So what are some things companies can do to spread their brand?
Well, I think first and foremost, they have to start and look and update their brand. I was on the phone the other day with a potential client and they had some videos up. And honestly, I thought, were those done in the 1980s, based on the clothing that people wore? And I know they're having a huge issue attracting talent. And I thought to myself, boy, if I looked at that, I don't know if I'd be that excited. And I'm a lot older than their average candidate. So I think it's important to also, if you're an older person and you have a son or a daughter who's in the job market, and those are positions you're trying to staff, entry-level jobs, asking them to go onto your website, asking them to apply for a job, asking them if they'd even want to apply for a job. Look at your socials. Oh, you don't have any? That's a problem. So there's a lot to this brand building, and companies are so willing to spend, billions of dollars to build their marketing brand. But then when it comes to their employer brand, maybe not so much.
And do you think that's because most have never just thought about it before? Or do they believe its importance?
I think it's a combination. And you and I both know, having been around the block a few times, that if it's related to sales and marketing, generally speaking, it's an unlimited budget. Right. When it comes to HR, you're going to give them the scraps.
Yeah. So this is the end of the first half of my conversation with Roberta Matuson. She's the talent maximizer, an executive coach and president of Matuson Consulting. When we come back in the next episode, Roberta and I are going to go into the popular topic of different generations in the workforce, and we'll circle back to the topic of being the kind of organization that most people want to work for and stay with. We've got some really interesting takes coming up, so stay tuned.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.